The waitress forgave the man who stole her future. But the billionaire CEO didn't. 3 weeks after Evelyn Carter walked into Whitmore Capital carrying the research Princeton tried to bury, Adrian Whitmore began preparing for war. Rain tapped softly against the windows of Whitmore Capital. Alone in his top-floor office, Adrian Whitmore stared at the thick research folder Evelyn Carter had left on his desk 3 nights earlier. On the cover, written in faded black ink, were the words, "Predictive Collapse Systems, Original Research by Evelyn Carter." Adrian slowly opened the folder again even though he had already memorized nearly every page inside it. Every equation. Every simulation. Every handwritten correction in the margins. Every timestamp older than Princeton's published research by more than a year. It all belonged to her. And yet another man was about to stand in front of the entire country, and be celebrated as a genius for stealing it. Behind him, the television played a financial news segment. Professor Howard Mercer smiled beside a crowd of reporters outside Princeton University. "This breakthrough may redefine predictive economic systems for the next generation," the interviewer said excitedly. Camera flashes exploded around Mercer. Applause filled the broadcast. Adrian's jaw tightened. The same man who had destroyed Evelyn's future, was now being praised as one of the greatest academic minds in America. His assistant stepped carefully into the office. Princeton officially confirmed that Professor Mercer will receive the National Innovation Medal in 3 weeks. Silence settled heavily across the room. Adrian slowly closed the folder before turning toward the skyline beyond the rain-covered glass. "Call legal," he said quietly. His assistant hesitated. "Sir." Adrian looked back toward the television screen where Mercer continued smiling confidently beside university officials. "She chose peace," Adrian said softly. His voice turned cold enough to freeze the room. "But I chose justice." Across Manhattan, inside a private hospital recovery suite funded entirely by the Whitmore Medical Foundation, Evelyn Carter adjusted the blanket around her sleeping mother, then quietly checked the medication monitors beside the bed. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic. A dim lamp glowed softly in the corner while rain tapped gently against the glass outside. Evelyn looked exhausted. Not the temporary exhaustion of a bad week. The kind that settles into someone after years of surviving instead of living. Her mother stirred weakly before opening her eyes. "You should go home and sleep, sweetheart." Evelyn forced a small smile. "I'm fine." But they both knew she wasn't. 3 jobs. Years of debt. Endless hospital nights. And now, after everything she sacrificed trying to survive, the past had returned demanding to be seen again. Her phone vibrated softly on the chair beside her. Adrian Whitmore. Evelyn stared at the screen for several seconds before finally answering. "What now?" Adrian's voice remained calm and controlled. "My team is reviewing the files you brought us." Silence settled briefly between them. Evelyn looked down at her sleeping mother. "You really think any of this matters anymore?" Adrian frowned slightly on the other end of the line. "If those files are authentic, someone stole years of your life." Evelyn closed her eyes slowly. No anger crossed her face. No satisfaction. Only exhaustion. "Do you know what happens when someone spends 3 years trying to survive?" Adrian said nothing. Her voice softened. "You stop thinking about justice." She leaned back in the chair beside the hospital bed. "You just pray your mother survives another month." The sentence hit Adrian harder than any accusation ever could. Evelyn wiped quietly beneath her eyes before continuing. "I don't want revenge, Adrian." "Evelyn, I'm tired." Silence stretched between them again. Then finally, almost in a whisper, she said, "Please, don't turn my life into another war." The line disconnected softly. Adrian slowly lowered the phone from his ear and stared at the dark reflection in his office windows. For the first time in years, he felt ashamed of how easy power had made his own life. The following morning, the executive boardroom at Whitmore Capital filled with attorneys, forensic analysts, cybersecurity investigators, and private intelligence consultants. Thick folders covered the long black conference table. Giant digital screens displayed recovered timestamps, archived Princeton emails, and side-by-side comparisons between Mercer's published work and Evelyn's original research. Adrian stood at the head of the table with both hands resting against the polished surface. "Everything in this room remains confidential until I say otherwise." One of the attorneys slowly flipped through Evelyn's notebook scans before looking up in disbelief. "My God," another analyst adjusted his glasses. "These timestamps predate Princeton's publication by nearly 18 months. A cyber forensic specialist spoke next. "We also recovered automatic cloud backups tied directly to Evelyn Carter's Princeton credentials." Adrian's eyes darkened slightly. "Can we prove intellectual theft?" The room went quiet for several long seconds before one of the senior attorneys finally answered. "Yes." Adrian straightened slowly. "Then tear the entire lie apart." But after the meeting ended, Adrian remained alone inside the dark boardroom staring at Evelyn's notebook projected across the giant screen. Equations filled the wall in glowing white lines while rain continued sliding down the windows behind him. Olivia quietly stepped back into the room. "You should go home." Adrian barely moved. "Do you know what bothers me the most?" Olivia stayed silent. Adrian looked toward one of Evelyn's handwritten notes preserved beside a timestamp from 4 years earlier. "Nobody noticed." His voice sounded distant now. "Not Princeton. Not the board. Not any of us." He exhaled slowly. "A woman that brilliant disappeared into survival, and people like me never even looked down long enough to see it happening." Olivia watched him carefully. Because for the first time since she had worked for Adrian Whitmore, she realized this was no longer about corporate reputation or legal exposure. This had become personal in a way Adrian himself probably did not fully understand yet. Instead of alerting Princeton publicly, Adrian buried the investigation inside Whitmore Capital itself. No press leaks. No legal threats. No public accusations. Only silence. Weeks passed, while his team worked behind closed doors, recovering deleted archives, rebuilding metadata timelines, and tracing every draft connected to Evelyn Carter's original Princeton credentials. The deeper they dug, the uglier the truth became. Entire sections of Mercer's published research had been copied directly from Evelyn's early doctoral simulations, including handwritten annotations preserved through automatic cloud backups Princeton never realized still existed. One evening, long after midnight, Adrian remained alone inside the dark conference room. Olivia stepped quietly into the room carrying another forensic report. "We confirmed the timestamps," she said softly. "Every major breakthrough in Mercer's publication originated from Evelyn's drafts." Adrian said nothing. His eyes remained fixed on the glowing equations covering the wall. Olivia studied him carefully before asking, "What now?" Adrian exhaled slowly. "Nothing." She frowned. "Nothing?" He finally looked toward her. "Not yet." Olivia understood immediately. He was waiting. Not for more evidence. For the right moment. Across Manhattan, life continued moving around Evelyn Carter as if the world had not quietly shifted beneath her feet. Sterling Oak remained full every night. Wealthy executives discussed investment portfolios and artificial intelligence startups over expensive wine, while Evelyn moved gracefully between tables, carrying silver trays beneath warm chandelier lights. Sometimes, customers recognized her face from small online clips taken at the gala weeks earlier. But most never connected the exhausted waitress pouring their wine, with the woman whose research now sat at the center of one of the biggest forensic investigations in Manhattan. Near the end of one late shift, Evelyn stepped onto the small rooftop employee terrace for air before returning to the hospital. Cold wind moved through the skyline while distant sirens echoed below. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to enjoy the silence. "You disappear up here a lot." Adrian's voice came softly from behind her. She turned and saw him holding 2 paper coffee cups. "Do billionaires normally stalk restaurant rooftops?" she asked tiredly. Adrian handed her one of the cups. "Only when they lose arguments." A faint smile almost touched her face before disappearing again. For several moments neither of them spoke. The city stretched endlessly around them beneath silver clouds. Finally Adrian asked quietly, "Do you ever miss it?" Evelyn stared into the steam rising from her coffee. "Princeton?" He nodded once. She remained silent so long Adrian almost thought she would not answer. Then finally she said softly, "I miss who I used to be before survival became my entire personality." The honesty in her voice hit him harder than anger ever could. Evelyn leaned against the railing beside him. "My father used to tell me intelligence was supposed to make the world bigger." She laughed quietly without humor. "Turns out sometimes it just makes people dangerous." Adrian looked at her carefully beneath the rooftop lights. "You know what bothers me the most?" Evelyn glanced toward him. His voice lowered slightly. "People like me would have walked past you 100 times without ever realizing what the world almost lost." Something fragile moved across Evelyn's expression before she quickly looked away toward the city lights below. Neither of them noticed how close they had drifted standing there in the cold night air. Not romance. Not fantasy. Just 2 exhausted people finally speaking honestly without pretending anymore. Meanwhile, Howard Mercer moved confidently through interviews, conferences, and media appearances completely unaware that his entire career was already collapsing beneath him. Princeton continued celebrating him publicly while television anchors praised his revolutionary contribution to predictive economics. Mercer enjoyed every second of the attention. Mercer still believed he was untouchable. And that made what was coming even more devastating. 2 nights before the National Innovation Summit, Olivia entered Adrian Whitmore's office carrying a small encrypted drive. "The auditorium system access is secured," she said carefully. Adrian looked up from Evelyn Carter's research notebook resting open across his desk. Equations and handwritten annotations covered the yellowed pages beneath the dim office lights. "Good." Olivia hesitated briefly before stepping closer to the desk. "Once this happens, there's no taking it back." Adrian slowly closed the notebook. His eyes drifted toward the folded cocktail napkin framed quietly beside his desk, the same napkin where Evelyn corrected his equation the night he humiliated her in front of Manhattan's elite. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then his voice turned colder. "Some truths deserve witnesses." Friday evening settled over Manhattan as journalists, economists, tech executives, and academic leaders filled the main auditorium of the American Innovation Forum at the Javits Center. Howard Mercer stepped confidently onto the red carpet outside the auditorium as microphones pushed toward him from every direction. "Professor Mercer," one reporter called out. "How does it feel to revolutionize predictive economics?" Mercer adjusted his tie proudly beneath the flashing lights. "History remembers those willing to see further than everyone else." Inside the massive auditorium, Princeton faculty members mingled with CEOs, senators, and technology executives beneath glowing chandeliers. Giant presentation screens illuminated the stage, casting the National Innovation Summit logo across the entire hall. Mercer moved through the crowd shaking hands confidently, completely unaware that his entire career stood moments away from collapse. Behind the stage, a quiet technician inserted an encrypted drive into the central presentation system while Olivia checked her watch nervously beside him. "Everything ready?" she asked softly. The technician nodded once. "Ready." Moments later, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage smiling brightly toward the packed auditorium. And now, applause echoed across the massive hall, the recipient of this year's National Innovation Award, Howard Mercer walked proudly onto the stage as the audience rose into a standing ovation around him. He smiled confidently beneath the lights while accepting the Crystal Award from the presenter before stepping toward the podium to begin his keynote presentation. Giant screens illuminated behind him, displaying the title of his research while cameras broadcast the event live across the country. Mercer adjusted the microphone with calm confidence. Innovation, he began smoothly, belongs to those willing to push beyond the limits of conventional thinking. Suddenly, the giant presentation screens behind him flickered black. The applause died instantly. Mercer paused mid-sentence and turned toward the screens in confusion. 1 second later, the screen split cleanly into two side-by-side research presentations. On the left appeared the title, Evelyn Carter, Original Princeton Draft. On the right, Howard Mercer, National Publication. Silence spread slowly through the auditorium. Then equations began appearing line by line across both screens simultaneously. Identical variables. Identical simulations. Identical conclusions. Entire sections matched word for word. A low wave of whispers rolled through the crowd as attendees leaned forward in disbelief. "Wait," someone whispered. "Those are exactly the same." Another voice spoke louder now. "Oh my God," more pages appeared. Side-by-side mathematical models. Matching annotations. Matching predictive structures. Then timestamps illuminated beneath Evelyn Carter's original drafts, dated more than a year before Mercer's published research. Mercer's face drained of color beneath the stage lights. "This is absurd," he snapped suddenly. "This presentation has been compromised." But nobody was listening anymore. Because people were no longer hearing accusations. They were watching theft happen in real time. A calm voice echoed from the back of the auditorium. "No," Adrian Whitmore stepped forward into the light as camera flashes exploded around him. The packed auditorium turned toward him instantly while reporters scrambled closer. Adrian walked slowly toward the stage, his expression cold and controlled. "For years," he said calmly, his voice cutting through the auditorium with terrifying precision, "one of the brightest minds Princeton ever produced was forced to serve wine to Manhattan's elite." His eyes locked directly onto Mercer. "While you built your reputation using her work." Mercer's breathing became uneven. "You do not understand how academia works." Adrian gave a faint humorless smile before stepping closer to the stage. "No," he said quietly. "But I understand exactly what happens when powerful people begin believing nobody will ever hold them accountable." Mercer looked desperately across the auditorium searching for support. Nobody moved. Nobody defended him. Because once the truth appeared in front of hundreds of cameras, every alliance disappeared instantly. Dean Wallace slowly approached the microphone looking pale beneath the lights. "Effective immediately, Princeton University will open a full ethics investigation regarding all published research associated with Professor Howard Mercer." Reporters surged forward instantly while cameras continued flashing wildly. "His awards, grants, and publications are now under formal review." Mercer stood frozen beneath the lights. For the first time in years, he looked less like a respected genius, and more like a frightened old man watching his legacy collapse in real time. The following week, Evelyn sat quietly beside her mother's hospital bed while soft rain touched the windows of St. Vincent's Medical Center. A nurse entered the room smiling warmly. "Your mother's latest scans look very promising." Evelyn covered her mouth instantly as tears filled her eyes. For the first time in years, she finally allowed herself to breathe. A few minutes later, another visitor entered quietly. Adrian. He carried a single envelope in one hand. Evelyn looked up suspiciously. "Now what?" Adrian smiled slightly. "Open it." Inside rested a formal offer letter from the Rutherford Institute of Advanced Systems Research. Senior Research Fellowship. Fully funded. Evelyn stared at the letter silently while her hands trembled. Adrian spoke softly. "They reviewed your original work." Her eyes filled with tears again. They called it revolutionary. Evelyn lowered her head slowly. After everything she lost, someone finally saw her for who she truly was. Not as a waitress. Not as a victim. But as a scientist. Tears rolled quietly down her face. I don't know what to say. Adrian looked at her carefully. You do not owe me gratitude. He paused. Briefly. The world owed you honesty. Before leaving the room, Adrian quietly placed something beside her hospital chair. Evelyn looked down after he walked away and froze when she realized what it was. The cocktail napkin from the gala. The same napkin where she corrected his equation while an entire ballroom watched him humiliate her. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unfolded it. At the very bottom, beneath her original handwriting, Adrian had added one sentence in neat black ink. The world finally sees the woman I should have seen that night. Evelyn closed her eyes tightly as tears slipped down her face. 3 months later, a massive research auditorium filled with scientists and academics from across the country rose to their feet in applause. Beneath bright white lights, Evelyn Carter stood confidently at the front of the stage. Behind her, a giant screen displayed the words, Evelyn Carter, Lead Research Fellow. She looked stronger now. Alive again. No longer hidden beneath exhaustion and survival. As the applause echoed through the auditorium, Evelyn glanced briefly toward the back row and saw Adrian Whitmore standing quietly near the exit away from the cameras and attention. No spotlight. No recognition. Just quiet respect. Their eyes met across the crowded room. And for the first time in years, Evelyn no longer looked like someone trying to survive the world. She finally looked like someone ready to belong in it again.